Okay. All right, so we're going live. Hello, everybody. It is February 26th. It is February 26th, 2023. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are so happy that you're joining us for this second part of Violetta's story about Tahirih. Welcome, welcome. We are just going live now, and we're happy to have you join us as we continue this second part of Tahirih. And we're going to finish a story which was left off last week. And you're more than welcome to check out that episode on YouTube or on Facebook for Clearwater Bahá'ís. You'll be floored by the amount of information that our speaker, Violetta Zein, was able to share with us last time. Violetta is an artist and a graphic designer. She works for a family school in Pointe-Noire in the Republic of Congo. In 2020, Violetta and Adib Masumian launched the Utterance Project. You should check it out on YouTube. And you can also visit its website, which is dedicated to the beauty of the utterances of Bahá'u'lláh, the Báb and Abdul-Baha in the original Persian or Arabic. Violetta is the author of 2 illustrated chronologies. 1, The Extraordinary Life of Abdul-Baha, and 2, The Blessed Beauty. So we welcome you to this topic today as we continue on the subject of Tahirih in honor of International Women's Rights Day on March 8th, 2023. Just one point before we hand it off to Miss Violetta, I want to point out it is a beautiful, wonderful time of year. We want to wish you all a happy Ayamiha as it is the holiday season and we get ready for the fast until the new year on the first day of spring. We welcome all of you to this beautiful session, and again, to all of the recorded sessions that you can find on Clearwater Bahá'ís on the YouTube channel. Violetta, we're so happy that you're here to finish the second part with us. As soon as you're ready, we're ready to go.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. So welcome to part 2 of the story of Tahirih. Part 1 focused really on Tahirih in Iraq and her discovery of the Bábí Faith and her enkindlement, her return to Qazvin, and we stopped at a real cliffhanger when Tahirih was locked in her father's house. She was watched by everyone and her life was in danger. There was an attempt to poison her and people had just decided to kill her. So we're going to pick up the story at that point. But before I start, I wanted to thank my father, Kamal Zein, Adib Masumian, and Mr. Fouad Izzadinia, who helped me with questions I had on this talk. And I want to also thank Sudabe Uladi and Greta Bosma, who are going to be reading the poems in Persian and English that precede every part today, like last week. And I want to just recommend 3 books to you that were very important for me in writing this story. The Trumpet, written by 3 women scholars and historians and journalists and poets. The Martha Root, Tahirih the Pure, Janet Rue Schoen's Rejoice in My Gladness, and Dr. Roya Ahavan's The Trumpet Blast. I really recommend these 3 books. So there are 2 slides that are not, where they describe Tahirih's martyrdom in detail, and they're not really appropriate for young children or people who are sensitive to descriptions like that. I will tell you right before each of the slides. They're not right after each other. So I'll warn you if you want to turn the volume down for that one slide. So with that said, this is where we stopped last week. After her uncle's murder, because the murderer was a Sheikhi, Tahirih was held responsible by her family, by the city of Qazvin, and she was under house arrest. And at the point where an attempt had been made to poison her and failed, another plan was announced to kill Tahirih. And Tahirih prophesied that day, if my cause is the cause of truth, if the Lord whom I worship be none other than the one true God, he will, ere 9 days have passed, deliver me from the yoke of tyranny. 9 days later, Tahirih was free. Bahá'u'lláh had planned an elaborate rescue mission to free Tahirih from her jail in Ghazvin and bring her safely back to Tehran. It was an ingenious plan, very detailed plan, perfectly executed by two hand-picked Bábís, a husband and wife team. The wife approached Tahirih and delivered the messages back and forth with her husband. The couple followed Baha'u'llah's every details in the instructions he had given them in a letter. They found the horses exactly where Baha'u'lláh has said, and they traveled on a deserted route, which Baha'u'lláh had told them to use. They reached Tihran at dawn, as Baha'u'lláh has said, and they headed straight to Baha'u'llah's house as soon as the gate of the city opened, using very extreme caution throughout every step of the way. So, Chapter 7, with Baha'u'lláh in Tehran. Sudabe?
Alapa, excuse me. Tala al-Baha wa ashraqat, Zahar al-Baha wa al-Ma'at. قلل الوجود سيرت فلكا لوجهه جماله همه آیه های مسلسله ز لسان او شده نازله همه انبیا محروله متحبجا به جماله.
Baha's sun glows high above the Prophet's mount. Before the lustrous beauty of his unveiled face, earth trembles, men flee, heavy rains pour down, leveling all except his rising place. In gold links of his language, chained by the sun, hundreds of prophets, love's multitude, over the wastelands, presciently run to him, haven of havens, love's amplitude. Sorry about the sound. I'm so sorry.
Right? Oh, sorry. Let me just turn. Okay. So Tahirih arrived at Baha'u'llah's house, at Baha'u'llah's and Asiya Hanum's house in Tehran, in a very, very weakened state. She was housed in the private parlor of Asiya Hanum on the upper floor. Asiya Hanum personally looked after Tahirih while she was their guest. And Tahirih soon recovered from her ordeal, and her very distinctive vitality, her energy returned. When word of Tahirih's escape started spreading through Tihran, the government hunted for her everywhere, but they were never able to find her. Meanwhile, while she was in Baha'u'llah's house, which was sort of the gathering place of the Bábís in Tehran, the Bábís started to stream in to see Tahirih and listen to her talk from behind a curtain. Tahirih had always intuitively recognized the station of the Báb and the station of Baha'u'lláh, as evidenced by the poem that we read when she was in Karbala. She composed a poem about Baha'u'lláh. But it's obvious in her every gesture and word during her time in Baha'u'llah's house in Tehran that she was aware of his station, that he wasn't just a visible Bábí and the leader of the Bábís in Tehran, but that she knew his station. Her spiritual acuity was really extraordinary. An astonishing fact about Tahirih is that she was the first person to recognize all three central figures of the faith. After recognizing the Báb in a dream and Baha'u'lláh through her intuition, before even meeting either of them, and she never met the Báb, but she understood beyond the shadow of a doubt the station of Abdul Baha, who was then a boy of only 4 years old as soon as she met him. And she was very attached to him throughout her stay in Abdullah's home. So Abdul Baha would later recall that Tahirih would chant poetry to him in her beautiful voice. And during her stay, several events happened that showed how deeply aware of his future rank she was. She was very devoted to Abdul Baha, and she often spent time talking to him. So when Vahid, a very illustrious Bábí, called on her in Baha'u'llah's home, and at this point, Vahid and Tahirih were probably two of the most erudite people in Persia. Vahid had memorized almost 30,000 traditions, and Tahirih was famous for knowing an oceanic number of traditions as well. Very, very, and so they would have probably had a lot to talk about. But when he came to call on her, believers came and said to Tahirih, who was with Abdul Baha, "Should you not leave the child and go with him?" Tahirih reportedly responded, shall I leave thee, protector of the cause, and go see one of the followers of the cause? That same day, a little bit later, Abdul Baha was sitting on Tahirih's knees behind the curtain, separating the men from the women during the gathering. And Tahirih interrupted Vahid, who was discussing the prophecies. He knew so many hadiths. The appearance of the Bab would have awoken in him everything he knew. So he was talking about prophecies. And she rebuked him. She reprimanded him. And she said, "O Sayyid," because Vahid was a Sayyid. He was descended from the ancestry of Muhammad. "O Sayyid, this is not the time for arguments, for discussion, for idle repetition of prophecies or traditions. This is the time for deeds. The day for words has passed." So Tahirih's stay in Tihran was spiritually powerful, but it was also brief. A few days after her arrival, Baha'u'lláh sent her to Khorasan, which was what the Bab had asked the Bábís to do. They asked them to head to the land of Ka, to Khorasan. And she sent Tahirih with other Bábís that were also heading in that direction, and Baha'u'lláh would follow them in a few days. So according to Baha'u'llah's, again, very detailed instructions, Mirza Musa, his younger faithful brother, full brother, took Tahirih out of Tehran through the northern destinations, Shimran Gate. They had a gate for the southern gate and eastern gate. So they went out through the northern gate, the Shimran Gate, close to Baha'u'llah's rented home. And they stopped in a delightful orchard, about 8 miles, 12 kilometers away. And Baha'u'lláh was very happy to hear Mirza Musa's report of Tahirih's departure, and he baptized the orchard Bahá'u'lláh, or Garden of Paradise, and said, "That house has been providentially prepared for your reception, that you may entertain in it the loved ones of God." Tahirih spent a week in the garden when supplies were being gathered, probably at the order of Baha'u'lláh, who is the one who funded and organized the entire conference of Badasht. And they were going to be there for a couple of weeks. So they had to gather enough supplies for almost 100 people. So after a week in the Garden of Paradise, Tahirih and her companions began their journey northeast. You can see on the map, they were leaving from Tihran to go to Badasht. And Baha'u'lláh soon began his journey also northeast towards Badasht, after entrusting his family into the hands of his brother, Mirza Musa. The conference of Badasht was about to take place, and around the same time, the Bab was also arriving in Chigri. So chapter 8, the conference of Badasht.
چو ظهور آن شه ما عرف عظمت شؤون او جلالهی به جهان جان شده از شرف حسنت و عز مقالهی همه جان جمله انس و جان شده در قدوم وی ارمغان به تعشق آمده عاشقان قتل سبيل وصاله طلع البهاء وأشرقت زهر البهاء وألمعت قلل الوجود بصرت فلکا لوجه جماله همه آیه های مسلسله ز لسان او شده نازله همه انبیا محروله متبهعجا به جماله.
The king walked in, and no one saw him come. His words, how beautiful. His face, how fair. Now everyone will perish at his feet. His lovers, drunk on joy, run to be there. The sun of glory, risen high. Glory, it shines now, sparkling, glowing in the air. The mountain peaks bow low before his beauty. They circle round like pilgrims lost in prayer. And endless verses flow from his sweet tongue. Prophets of old rush from the past to hear.
The conference of Badasht lasted a little bit more than 3 weeks, 22 days, from the 26th of June to the 17th of July, 1848. And it coincided exactly with the transfer of the Bab from Tahirih to Tabriz, where he would be interrogated and imprisoned for 40 days. 81 Bábís attended. The 3 gardens were rented with a stream flowing through them, one for Tahirih, one for Qudus, and one for Bahá'u'lláh. And Badasht was about 400 kilometers or 250 miles northeast of Tihran. So each of the 3 gardens had its own pavilion. This is a picture of the hamlet of Badasht. Not exactly where, it's close to where the conference took place. And all the pavilions were arranged by Baha'u'lláh, and the rest of the attendees, so 81 minus 3, they slept in the tents that were placed in the orchard all around. The main purpose of the conference in the hamlet was to set in motion the sort of the public existence of the Bábí movement by initiating a sudden, a complete, a very dramatic break from Islam and Islamic traditions, Islamic ceremonies, and the Islamic ecclesiastical order. Baha'u'lláh Baha'u'lláh sort of directed the conference. He was the guiding hand behind the conference because he'd organized it, he'd funded it, and he'd received instructions from the Bab, most probably, about where it was to be held. He managed the conference in a way where people never really realized who was behind everything. It was so subtle. He directed things in such a magisterial way, you know. It was extraordinary. On each of the 22 days of the conference, Baha'u'lláh revealed the tablet, and he bestowed a new name on each of the 81 participants. That is when Qudus became known as Qudus, Tahirih became known as Tahirih, although the title of Tahirih was given to her by the Bab, and it was formalized by Baha'u'lláh at the conference of Badasht. No one really suspected that it was Baha'u'lláh who had bestowed these new names on them, because when the conference was over, the Bab revealed a special tablet for each of the attendees of the conference, addressing them by the name they had been given at the conference. So there were three main figures in the conference. Tahirih was really galvanized by the conference of Badasht. This was really the place for Tahirih. She had always been a disruptor, a revolutionary. When she was a sheikhi, she was like a very ardent sheikhi. When she was a Bábí, she was a very ardent Bábí, and she was always pushing people to action. And so her very presence there as a leader of the Bábís was really a way to herald the new social laws of the Bábí and Bahá'í Faiths, really. She was spurred on by Bahá'u'lláh, and she was assisted by Qudus. They were the three main leaders of the conference. And Bahá'u'lláh and Qudus assisted Tahirih to bring in these revolutionary changes because she was known as a revolutionary. They each had their role at the conference, a role that was orchestrated beforehand. And so the role of Bahá'u'lláh was the moderator, the moderate force. The role of Qudus was to represent the conservative element in the Bábís. And the role of Tahirih, of course, was the revolutionary, the standard breaker, you know? This pre-existing arrangement is something that Shoghi Effendi has confirmed. And it was a stratagem that was very carefully calculated to spur the Bábís into awakening to this new faith, completely new faith, new teachings. And to realize what they had signed on for, you know, that it was something bold, new, and this was the whole goal of the conference of Badasht. So one day when Bahá'u'lláh was feeling slightly ill, he was in bed with a slight illness. He was surrounded by Qudus and the participants of the conference, and a messenger from Tahirih arrived, summoning Qudus to her pavilion. And this was all sort of a prearranged theatrical in a sense. So Qudus responded, "I have severed myself entirely from her. I refuse to meet her." The messenger returned, adding that if he continued to refuse, that she would come to him. And Qudus refused again. The messenger took out his sword and laid it on the ground, saying, "I refuse to go without you. Either choose to accompany me to the presence of Tahirih or cut off my head with this sword." So at the exact moment when Qudus picked up the sword as if to comply, Tahirih appeared, unveiled, unadorned, before the company of the entire assembly of Bábí men. The effect of seeing Tahirih unveiled was instantaneous. It was electric. It was astounding. The men assembled, one and all raised in a Muslim culture, had never laid eyes on an unveiled woman that was not their wife or their mother or their daughter. And so to their eyes, still filled with the remnants of Islamic culture, Tahirih had defamed herself, and she has shamed the Bábí name. Some covered their faces, others fell to their knees, others pulled their garments over their head to stop seeing her in an attempt to not commit what Islam considered a sin. One even tried to cut his throat, I think. But some of the men, probably a small minority, knew exactly what they were witnessing. They recalled the tradition, the Islamic tradition that said on the Day of Judgment, Fatimeh, which was Tahirih's birth name, Fatimeh herself, in the tradition, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, would appear unveiled on the Day of Judgment. Tahirih had not just removed her veil. She had single-handedly proclaimed the inauguration of a new dispensation with a new role for women. And she was breaking the last tie with Islam by removing the veil, Islam's possibly most visible symbol. She stood in front of her brothers and triumphantly declared, "I am the word which the Qaim is to utter, the word which shall put to flight the chiefs and nobles of the earth. This is the day of festivity and universal rejoicing, the day on which the fetters of the past are burst asunder. Let those who have shared in this great achievement arise and embrace each other." For the rest of the conference, Tahirih and Qudus pretended to continue disagreeing, while Bahá'u'lláh, in the end, stepped in and effected a planned reconciliation, healing the wounds that their disagreements had caused. At one point during the last days of the conference, Tahirih brandished an unsheathed sword and rallied the Bábís, saying, "Wrap up this spectacle. The time for prayer and liturgy is over. Now is the time for devotion and sacrifice." After the conference, the Bábís left Badasht and traveled towards the district of Noor. Tahirih and Qudus shared a howdah prepared for them by Baha'u'lláh. That is a 19th century engraving of a howdah, which is a little tent made of wood, and it's placed on the back of a horse with a suspension system, and 1 or 2 people can travel in the howdah. They took mountain roads to avoid the government officials who might be trying to arrest them. There were arrest warrants out for some of them, and they stopped in the village of Niyala at the foot of a mountain. And at dawn, they were awoken by the villagers who were throwing stones from on top of the mountain. The attack was so fierce that everyone dispersed. And when it ended, Baha'u'lláh found only Tahirih and 1 other Bábí. Baha'u'lláh was able to speak to the villagers and convince them of the cruelty and shamefulness of their act. And he entrusted Tahirih and her maidservant to the new companion, who had been the only one left after the attack in Niyala, and sent them on to Noor, his home province, his ancestral province. And he had arranged a shelter for Tahirih there. So this would have been in the summer, August of 1848. And for about 2 years, Tahirih lived in Noor. We know very little about her wanderings during these 2 years in the home district of Baha'u'lláh, between the conference of Badasht and her imprisonment in Tihran. But we know she spent about 2 years there in the region of in the Noor region of Mazindaran. And during the first year, it seems that Tahirih would have traveled from place to place, visiting many different villages. And she started with Barfurush, and she spoke publicly in a mosque there. But the enthusiasm and the devotion that she caused incited jealousy and anger from the clerics, and she had to leave. She had to leave the village. She then stayed in Amul, which is where Baha'u'lláh would be imprisoned and tortured in a few months. This is the native town of Qudus, and she was there sometime in September 1848, and she stayed with a friendly mullah. After this, it seems like Tahirih lived for about a year in a farm in the village of Vaz, which is the valley that you see here on the photograph. That's where Tahirih spent the last year of her freedom. And at this point in the story, 10 of the 18 letters of the living had been martyred, and Tahirih was one of the few left alive. Someone in Vaz, or the surrounding area of Vaz, reported Tahirih's presence to the authorities, and she was arrested in January 1850 and taken to Tihran and charged with accessory to the murder of her father-in-law in Hazvi. He had been murdered since. She had been separately summoned by the 2 most powerful men in Iran, Nasiruddin Shah, the very young new monarch, and his prime minister, Mirza Taqi Khan, a man so powerful that the Shah called him his regent. So now, chapter 9, Tahirih's imprisonment in Tihran. In order to create a sense of unity for the last 4 parts of the presentation, I've picked one poem, a very long poem, but a very well-known poem of Tahirih's, called "If on Thine Eyes Mine Own Should Fall." And this translation is by Joshua Hall, and you can find it on his website. And it's a 7-verse poem, and I've put 2 verses in each part, and the last verse for the last part of the entire talk. So these are verses 1.
گر به تو افتدم نظر چهره به چهره رو به رو شهر دهم غم تو را نکته به نکته مو به مو از پی دیدن رخت همچو صبا فتاده ام کوچه به کوچه در به در خانه به خانه کوه به کوه.
If on thine eyes mine own should fall, two gazes fixed twixt thee and me, in revelation of it all, I'd speak of how I've yearned for thee. To see thy face, whom I adore, the breeze's way have I deemed meet, blowing house to house, door unto door, down alleyway, street unto street.
Tahirih arrived in Tehran in January of 1850. She was now in her mid-30s, and she'd been summoned by this new Shah, Nasruddin Shah, who was only 19 years of age. It's reported that Tahirih met with the young Shah prior to her confinement, and he offered her a pardon if she would only recant her faith. When she arrived in his presence, it seems that Nasruddin Shah was so taken by her that he declared, "I like her looks. Leave her and let her be." She was now confined for the fourth time in her life, and she was kept in a small room high up in the home of Mahmud Khan, the mayor of Tehran, in a home with no stairs that could only be reached with a ladder. It was in this room that she received the Shah's letter containing a marriage proposal and an offer to make her the guardian of his harem. On the back of his own letter, Tahirih replied, "Kingdom, wealth, and power for thee, beggary, exile, and loss for me. If the former be good, it's thine. If the latter is hard, it's mine." When the Shah received her reply, it's reported that he said, "So far, history has not shown us such a woman." In the first year that Tahirih was captured, it was a very bloody year. The 7 martyrs of Tihran found their death in February 1850, including the Bab's beloved maternal uncle, Haji Mirza Sayyid Ali. Vahid lost his life along with 60 Bábís in the Nayriz uprising. In June of that year, June 1850, the Bab was martyred. The Nayriz uprising was in June. The Bab was martyred 1 month later on the 9th of July, 1850. And after a 9-month siege, the Zanjan uprising ended with the martyrdoms of Hujjat and Zein. 4,000 Bábís were killed in that 1 year. During her imprisonment, Tahirih was not allowed pen and paper. So she made her own ink with green vegetable juice. And she used straws from a broom as quills. And she wrote on food wrappings. She wrote thrilling poems, some in praise of Bahá'u'lláh and complex allusions, sublime ideas, and eloquent verses. And she wrote letters to friends, including the poet Behjat. She was not completely cut off from Bábís, and her influence continued to grow despite her imprisonment, particularly among women. Tahirih was a captive, but her spirit was soaring. She was enkindled, she was aflame, she was enamored, she was restless, she just could not keep still. And it was during these years in Tehran that Tahirih's popularity was at its height. She had a profound influence on the women serving in the household of the mayor and the mayor's wife, and all of the women who thronged through the door of the mayor's house to see her. She rose every day slightly before dawn when everyone was still asleep. She performed her ablutions, gently chanting prayers and praises for God. She kept her small room absolutely spotless, never left it during the day, but it was her habit to walk in the courtyard at night, her only exercise. And this was the area of the house where there was a bath where she could bathe. And even when she was alone, Tahirih was always neatly dressed, and behaved as if she was in the company of other people, always ready. Sometimes she would rise and pacing, she would pray, and sometimes she would read from the Quran. During this year, Tahirih met a princess, a granddaughter of Fatih Ali Shah, Shamsi Jahan. She had been fascinated with the claims of the Bab at the start of his ministry, and a Bábí who was in her employ encouraged her to go and meet Tahirih. So Tahirih and Shamsi Jahan actually had something in common. They were both poets, and the prince's pen name was Fitna. The princess was taking a walk in the gardens by the mayor's house with her attendants, silently praying that she would be able to catch a glimpse of Tahirih. And all of a sudden, Tahirih opened her windows of her small room up in the house of the mayor, and she called down, "What do you want, princess?" The princess took so the princess was astonished that her prayer was answered so immediately. And she looked at Tahirih's smiling face, and she burst into tears, and Tahirih burst out laughing. The princess she would remember how strange that encounter was, that she was outside in a garden, and she was free, and she was crying, and Tahirih was inside, and she was a captive, and she was laughing. She called up to Tahirih and said, "My lady, I would like to know why you were imprisoned." Sorry. I don't think the story's over yet. So Tahirih responded, "Because I have spoken the truth. Why did the descendants of Muhammad fall into captivity? Because they also spoke the truth. Where is the truth? The center of truth appeared in the world and they killed him. Is it the one they killed in Tabriz? Yes, he was our promised one, your promised one and mine, and they martyred him." The princess asked, "Who were those disciples in the fortress of Tabarsi?" They also were his disciples. When Tahirih added, "Go, princess, or you will be in trouble," she shut her window and withdrew a moment before the mayor's guards circled the princess and asked what she was doing. "I came here for a walk," she haughtily told them. They probably knew why she had come, but they decided to believe her excuse and said, "Very well, now that you have finished your walk, kindly leave." The princess left, but for days afterward, she cried, hoping to see Tahirih again. A few days later, her prayer was answered again. She was at a wedding, and as people were expressing interest in Tahirih, they sent word to the mayor's house to bring her so that they can meet her. So as soon as Tahirih arrived, her very presence lifted the women's hearts. And one woman recalled, "When I saw her, my heart was filled with happiness. When Quratul Ayn entered the room, she was so beautiful and so dignified. And when she spoke, it was with such power that we gradually turned to her and came and listened to her and forgot about the wedding." Tahirih stole the show. She effortlessly attracted everyone's attention with her radiance, told funny stories that made the women laugh, recounted her sufferings, which made them cry. She chanted her poetry, and as a result, a large number of women present became Bábís. Chapter 10, Martyrdom. Verses 3 and 4.
می رود از فراق تو خون دل از دو دیده ام، دجله به دجله، یم به یم، چشمه به چشمه، جو به جو. دور دهان تنگ تو عارض عنبرین خطت، قنچه به قنچه، گل به گل، لاله به لاله، بو به بو.
There flows when I am not with thee, from these two eyes, mine own heart's blood, spring unto spring, sea unto sea, stream into stream, flood into flood. Those lips so bud-like at their close, those locks so perfume redolent, bloom unto bloom, rose unto rose, tulip to tulip, scent to scent.
On August 15th, 1852, three young misguided Bábís who had been rendered half mad by grief decided to avenge the Báb by trying to assassinate Nasruddin Shah as he was leaving his castle, his palace for a hunting expedition. But they were only armed with short daggers and a pellet pistol, so they couldn't really inflict anything but a superficial wound on the Shah. And they were stopped by his guards when they tried to drag him off his horse. The botched attempt on the Shah's life had just immense repercussions. Pandemonium broke out, and Tihrán was plunged into just an unimaginable chaos. And the repercussions on the Bábí community were immediate. The authorities rounded up 81 Bábís, including 38 leaders of the Bábí community of Tihrán. And in the words of Shohei Effendi, the reign of terror which ensued was revolting beyond description. The attempted assassination on the Shah was what precipitated Tahirih's martyrdom. Persia was engulfed in this countrywide massacre against the Bábís. And shortly after the assassination attempt, Mirza Agha Khan, the new prime minister, sent two mujtahids to interrogate Tahirih and get her to recant her faith. The two clerics held 7 lengthy meetings with Tahirih and found themselves unable to withstand her powerful arguments. So they issued a religious judgment, a fatwa, branding her as a heretic who must be put to death. Shortly after this, the Shah met with Tahirih for a second time and once again encouraged her to recant her faith in return for her life. Of course, Tahirih refused, and the Shah was forced to issue a final decree for her execution. But because of the nationwide repercussions of you have to understand Tahirih was very well known. And for her to be executed publicly would have been an absolute scandal. So that had to be done in secret. And we don't know the exact date of when she was martyred, but we believe it was shortly after the attempt on the life of the Shah and after Bahá'u'lláh entered the Siyachal, but not long after. So sometime in August, probably, but we don't know an exact date yet. On the night of her martyrdom, Tahirih demonstrated once again her intuition that had never failed her, that gift that Persians call second sight. She knew that the time of her death was imminent, and even before she'd been informed of the fatwa. That night, she left her room and climbed down the courtyard where she bathed. Then she returned to her room and wore her most costly dress of snow white silk. And while singing, she perfumed herself with the choicest attar of roses, content and happy. She said her goodbyes to the women of the household that she'd known for 2 years and asked them to forgive her for the inconvenience of her presence in the house, behaving at the same time like a woman preparing herself for her wedding night and someone going on a long journey. Once Tahirih had said her goodbyes, she wrapped herself in a shawl, filled with joy, smiled at the weeping women around her, and said, "Tonight I am going to undertake a very great voyage." So if there's young children present, you may want to mute this slide, or if you're sensitive to descriptions of death, The mayor's wife went up to Tahirih's room that evening, and Tahirih gave her specific instructions. She said, "I'm preparing to meet my beloved and wish to free you from the cares and anxieties of my imprisonment. Weep not, the time for your lamentation is not yet come. I wish to share with you my last wishes, for the hour when I shall be arrested and condemned to suffer martyrdom is fast approaching. I would request you to allow your son to accompany me to the scene of my death, and to ensure that the guards and executioner in whose hands I shall be delivered will not compel me to divest myself of this attire. It is also my wish that my body be thrown into a pit, and that pit be filled with earth and stones. 3 days after my death, a woman will come and visit you, to whom you will give this package. I will now deliver into your hands. My request is that you permit no one henceforth to enter my chamber. From now until the time I shall be summoned to leave this house, let no one be allowed to disturb my devotions. This day I intend to fast, a fast which I shall not break until I am brought face to face. Tahirih then asked the woman, the mayor's wife, to lock the door and not open it until it was time for her. 4 hours after sunset, there was a knock on the door to the street. The guards were here, demanding that Tahirih be delivered into their hands. The mayor's wife was struck with terror at this news, so she unlocked the door to Tahirih's room with trembling hands, only to find that Tahirih was already pacing the room, chanting a grieving but triumphant litany. As soon as she saw the mayor's wife, she walked up to her and kissed her. She placed into her hands the key to her chest, which contained her personal effects: a small perfume bottle, prayer beads, and 3 rings, 1 turquoise, 1 cornelian, and 1 ruby, as a remembrance of her stay in this house, saying, "Whenever you open this chest and behold the things it contains, you will, I hope, remember me and rejoice in my gladness." With these words, she bid her last farewell, and accompanied by the woman's son, she disappeared before the mayor's wife's eyes. Tahirih said, "Run and open the door. It is me they have come for." The mayor entered, saying, "Come, madam, you have been summoned." Tahirih replied, "You can kill me as soon as you like, but you cannot stop the emancipation of me." This is the second slide where Tahirih's death is described in detail. If you're sensitive to such descriptions or you have a child present, please mute just for this length of this slide. So the mayor gave his son, whom Tahirih requested to be present at her execution, a sealed envelope with instructions to bring Tahirih to the garden of Il-Khani and deliver her in the hands of Aziz Khan Sardat, the minister of war. The son placed Tahirih on a horse and covered her with his coat so that she would look like a man. And accompanied by an escort, he took her to the garden and placed Tahirih in a room at the entrance once they arrived. The minister was sitting alone, waiting for him, and asked, "Nobody knows who you have brought here?" Mayor's son replied, "Nobody. And now that I have fulfilled my mission, give me the release form for my prisoner." The minister refused and insisted the son help him execute her. The minister summoned a Turkish servant and gave him 20 pieces of gold and a silk handkerchief to strangle Tahirih. The son led him to her. She was prostrate in a state of prayer. The servant walked towards her, and she raised her head and defiantly spoke, "Young man, it would be unworthy for your hand to soil itself with this murder." The servant ran off like a madman and said he would not touch Tahirih. Next, the minister summoned one of his horsemen who was being punished for another offense. He gave him alcohol, and he gave him another silk handkerchief and asked him to kill Tahirih. The man walked into her room and with no hesitation strangled her until she fell unconscious, then picked up her body and threw it into a well while she was still alive. As dawn was breaking, the minister and the mayor's son called men to quickly fill the well with stones and dirt. And that is how Tahirih's glorious, incandescent life was snuffed out like a candle, covered over by darkness. Abdul Baha spoke of Tahirih's enduring spirit, saying, "Salutations be unto her and praise. Holy be her dust, as the tears of light come down to it from heaven." And referring to her martyrdom, he stated, "Tahirih rejoiced. She had heard with a light heart the tidings of her martyrdom. She set her eyes on the supernal kingdom and offered up her life." The epilogue to this talk is in two parts. Part 1 is chapter 11, Poet, verses 5 and 6.
ابر و چشم و خال تو صید نموده مرغ دل، طبع به طبع، دل به دل، مهر به مهر و خو به خو. مهر تو را دل حزین بافته بر قماش جان، رشته به رشته، نخ به نخ، تار به تار، پو به پو.
Thy brow, thine eye, thy fair cheek's mole have all ensnared with subtle art my spirit's bird, soul unto soul, love unto love, heart unto heart. Into the spirit's warp and weft, and into every thread thereof, this heart of mine of joy bereft hath weaved the fabric of thy love.
This is not a photo of Tahirih. This is a portrait of a Persian woman in the late 19th century by Antoine Sevrugin. Very fascinating man and very fascinating photographs. You should really look at it. So the reason Tahirih's poetry is so important is because it is the only place where we can really hear Tahirih, which is why I worked so hard to put a Persian and English translation of her poems in here so we could hear her voice. Amin Banani argues that if we're to appreciate to their full measure the heroic dimension of Tahirih's life, we have to see Tahirih like she saw herself. And her poetry is the key that unlocks that door. And I agree with him. Tahirih's poetry reveals the layers of complex motivations that make up Tahirih. Such a difficult to grasp, fascinating, mysterious figure. They make her accessible because to hear her, we can hear her voice, and when we listen, we can hear her speak for herself, talk about the Persia that she lived in, the things she cared about, what motivated her, her spirituality, Bahá'u'lláh, and what she wanted to change in the culture that she was living in. Tahirih's voice, words really are her voice, and we're really lucky to have the poems that we have. Tahirih was a brilliant scholar and a deeply intuitive mystic. She combined intellectual rigor and soaring spirit. And as much as she personified the core Shaykhi belief that in order to understand divine will, it's necessary to combine spiritual intuition and wise proof. That was one of the core beliefs of the Shaykhi movement. And much of her writings have been lost, but the remaining writings of Tahirih comprise, for the most part, of a very large number of poems, many of which have only been discovered and translated since 2001. So it can be said that we can look at the broader picture, and the majority of Tahirih's poetry is a sort of an exquisite celebration of the progressive revelation to humanity, and also an ecstatic announcement of the revelations of the Bábí and Bahá'u'lláh, inaugurated in the day of resurrection. Tahirih's poetry is unmatched because it masterfully combines Sufi, think I hear birds. It combines Sufi symbolism, Shaikhi theology, Islamic thought, bold, very, very original theological interpretation, which Tahirih was known for since her early childhood, really, because she was known for interpreting the obscure hadiths about the coming of the promised one. All of this is wrapped up in her poetry, along with philosophy and some traditional Persian imagery, like roses or nightingales. Tahirih demonstrates over and over again in her poetry that she is a deeply modern visionary, and she and over and over again her understanding of the station of Bahá'u'lláh, but in modern terms. Like, she understood the station of Baha'u'lláh and Abdul Baha as we do now in 2023, but in 1840, 1844, 1848, 1850. She had this very modern understanding of the covenant, of the faith, of the dispensation, of progressive revelation, and all of that is wrapped up into her poetry. She also had a very strong awareness of her role as a remover of veils, to disclose truths. And she also had a very refined understanding of what needed to be unveiled and what needed to remain concealed. So she wasn't, it wasn't like she was very, very careful about the things that she unveiled and the things she didn't. Most of Tahirih's poems are a type of poem called the ghazal, which is a love poem that consists of 5 to 15 independent couplets, linked in theme, and there are different kinds of meter, and it gets very, very complicated. But the Kamil meter is one of the most popular meters, and it's a pattern of rhyming within each line. When you listen to the last poem in Persian, and you'll hear that the poem rhymes within the poem. Like in the middle of the poem and at other parts of the poem, there's sounds that come up, like a ooh, 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 or a ta, 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 you know? So listen to the last verse and then listen to the video afterwards, and you can hear it in all the other poems. It's really amazing. So it's very common. It's common in Arabic poetry, but it's rare in Persian poetry. And so one striking feature of Tahirih's poetry is that she wrote ghazals that were sometimes not about love at all, something that is never done. She wrote ghazals that were epic. Some of them were proclamatory. Some of them were full of startling images and radical vocabulary. And she used the most classic meter, the Kamil meter, the perfect meter, and turned it on its head using, for example, hissing alliterations to go run through the verses and emphasize her criticism of ignorance and superstition. So she employed a really traditional, really well-known form of poetry and a really traditional, really common meter, but she turned both on their heads and she disrupted them before disrupting was a popular thing. So she was really, really groundbreaking. And in the discussion portion, you can ask Sudabe a little bit more about the Persian poems. They are very, 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 very hard to read. So Sudabe can attest to that in the discussion portions. So at times, this is a very traditional Persian painting. So that's why I put it here, to show you a little bit about what we're talking about. Tahirih would write a poem about herself using a very classic Persian poetry imagery and famous symbolisms of romantic heroisms with beautiful hair and scented hair and beautiful eyes and hair. But she would even use these traditional imagery and create like almost a known environment for the Persian hearers of her poem. But then suddenly out of this known environment would emerge this rebellious woman, this trumpeter of prophecies, this incredible creature that you did not expect just emerge out of the poem with irrepressible passion, indomitable will, unconquerable power, just very surprising at every turn. And she wrote poetry in a very classical, difficult style, using very difficult words, very complex philosophical ideas, very complicated traditions, very obscure references, and they're extremely hard to understand. And what's really interesting is that all of that complexity, as you've heard Sudabe read them, they don't interfere with the rhythm of the poem. They don't interfere with anything at all. the spontaneous flow is not interrupted by how complex the structure is and the ideas and the philosophy and the words, and that there's so much Arabic. I mean, yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of Arabic in these Persian poems. So her poems are often ecstatic and inspiring, and they have really graceful rhythm and excellent diction. So they really lend themselves to be chanted as well. So the second part of the epilogue is Tahirih's legacy. And this is the last verse of the poem. So let's listen to see if we can pick out the sound that's being repeated throughout the verses.
در دل خویش گشت و نجست جز تو را صفحه به صفحه لاله به لاله پرده به پرده تو به تو.
Her own heart Tahirih perused, from page to page and fold to fold, and it with thee was so suffused that only thee could she behold.
Oh, I don't want to leave Tahirih. I'm going to start by giving some tributes of Tahirih by the Bab, Bahá'u'lláh, and Abdul Baha, just to wrap up our understanding of her station, her really unique station. So the Bab revealed several tablets specifically about Tahirih, and in one of them he states, "She verily, in mine estimation, is a noble leaf who have purified her heart from the defilement of limitations for the sake of her Lord. May God bless all those who appreciate her station and refrain from harming her even to the slightest degree. For verily she is in this day the pride of her kin and the honor of all who follow her in the command of God." Undeniable statement about her rank as a leader of the Bábís. Although she was a woman, she was also a leader. In yet another letter, the Bab also writes about Tahirih. "She is the one who believed in her Lord and opposed her selfish desires, and feared the justice of her Lord and awaited the day of meeting her Creator. Verily, it would be contrary to my pleasure for anyone to deny her. And if they hear a pronouncement from her that their minds are unable to grasp and their souls unable to understand, leave it in his path until God will pass judgment through the power of truth." In another tablet, the Bab writes, "It is not for any of the dwellers in the abode of justice to refute Tahirih in her knowledge, for verily she is aware of the realities of the divine revelation by the grace of God, and she is in this day a source of honor for this host. Whoso causeth any injury to her person has committed a grievous sin." You'll notice in a lot of these tablets of the Bab, he protects Tahirih by his words, and he warns anyone if they're going to hurt a hair on her head. This is something he did over and over again. He came to her defense. It's an incredible story between the Bab and Tahirih. This now is a tribute by Bahá'u'lláh, who wrote in later years that she had been one of his most fiery followers, and he called her the point of ecstasy, Janabi Ta. Janabi Ta means Janabi Tahirih. There was the point of ecstasy, Janabi Ta. Upon her be the glory of God, the most glorious. For a long time she was with this servant, and would not have bartered a moment of her visit with this servant for the kingdom of this world or the next. Indeed, she did not wish to be separated from me, even for a moment. But what happened was destined to occur, and so many were the verses and poems she uttered regarding this wondrous faith. In a lengthy tablet of visitation to be recited for Tahirih, Baha'u'lláh affirms in a paragraph How can I make mention of the calamities thou endured, O crimson leaf? By God, the leaves of Sudratul Muntaha, the tree beyond which there is no passing, were shed after you fell from the tree of the cause, and the boughs of the tree of immortality broke off, and the branches of the low tree of paradise were dried up, and the hearts of the holy ones bled, and the faces of the chosen ones turned pale, and the hearts of the pious were lacerated in the garden of repose, and the faithful spirit cried out in the presence of thy Lord, and lamented all that dwell on earth and in heaven. Thou art the one who, as soon as thou heard the call of God, did not tarry even for a moment, and rushed towards him detached from all else save him, and believed in him and his supreme verses, and recognized his manifestation in his days. Thou art the one who wast a stranger in thy homeland, and a prisoner in thy house, and held far from the court of holiness, despite thy yearning, and was prohibited from the habitation of nearness, despite thy longing. I will leave this one for later. Tahirih is an enigma, a mystery. It's very hard to really understand how much of a revolutionary she was. She was beautiful. She was deliberately outrageous. She was astoundingly intelligent. She was deeply spiritual. She was a mystic. She was fiery in her eloquence. She was an activist. She was a radical. She was transgressive. She was a poet. She was a revolutionary. She was obedient to the covenant. Tahirih was a letter of the living. She was a martyr. She was the trumpeter of the day of resurrection from Islamic prophecies. She stands apart from all the holy women of the Bábí dispensation in that she cast away her role as a wife and a mother and daughter and niece. And she occupied spaces that had been traditionally reserved to men. She became an actor and a leader in the Baha'i community. Because we have no photographs of Tahirih, this last section is going to honor her through the impact that she's had over the course of 2 centuries on artists and writers and historians alike. Professor Edward Granville Brown of Cambridge University, here photographed dressed as a Persian, wrote in his book, A Traveler's Narrative, the introduction of his book, because that's actually Abdul Baha's book. The appearance of such a woman as Tahirih, Quratul Ain, in any country and in any age, a rare phenomenon. But in such a country as Persia, it is a prodigy, nay, almost a miracle. Alike in virtue of her marvelous beauty, her rare intellectual gifts, her fervent eloquence, her fearless devotion, and her glorious martyrdom, she stands forth incomparable amidst her countrywomen. Had the Bábí religion no other claim to greatness, this were sufficient, that it produced a heroine like Quratul Ain. No Baha'i figure has really captured the collective imagination as much as Tahirih. According to Azar Nafisi on the left, a notable Iranian academic and author, she described Tahirih's influence in feminism as the first woman to unveil and to question both political and religious orthodoxy, stating that modern-day Iranian women carry on this tradition. Mariana Hainish on the right, the mother of an Austrian president and the founder of the New Women's Movement for Austria, claimed to have been inspired by stories of Tahirih. Looking back on her life, she stated, "The greatest ideal of womanhood all my life has been Tahirih of Ghazvin, Iran. I was only 17 years old when I heard of her life and her martyrdom. But I said, I shall try to do for the women of Austria what Tahirih gave her life to do for the women of Persia." Tahirih has inspired writers since the 19th century. Long before the Baha'i Faith had made its way west, Europeans had been inspired and fascinated by her. Lord Curzon, on the left, called her one of the most affecting episodes in modern history, her life, sorry. And Mary von Najmacher, the gifted Austrian poet on the right, heard of Tahirih in 1870 and was inspired to write her greatest poem on Tahirih's life. In the 20th century, her impact still could be felt on the arts, particularly on theater. A play by Isabella Grinevskaya on the left, On the Bab, had a focus on Tahirih. It was first performed in St. Petersburg in 1904. In 1908, Constance Fauntleroy-Runcie, on the right, wrote a novel about Tahirih. Abdu'l-Baha also spoke about Tahirih in his address on women's suffrage to the Women's Freedom League on January 2nd, 1913 in London. Sarah Bernhardt, on the left, the best-known French actress of her day, asked her two contemporary authors, Catulle Mendes and Henri-Antoine Jumlois, to write a play about Tahirih and the Bábís for her to portray on stage. I don't think they wrote the play, but she did ask them to. Tahirih has continued to inspire writers and artists of all backgrounds until the present day. A contemporary Iranian writer, Shahrnush Fasipur, mentions Tahirih as one of her literary inspirations. Bahi Naqshbani's book, The Woman Who Reads, published in 2007, tells the story of Tahirih as mother, sister, daughter, and wife. In 2015, Delia Olam co-wrote and staged a one-woman play, Just Let the Wind Untie My Perfumed Hair, telling the story of Tahirih's final days. And Nazanin Afshan Jam is set to play a role as Tahirih in a film by Jack Lentz named Mona's Dream, about the life story of Mona Mahmoudinejad. Perhaps there's no better tribute to Tahirih's life than the slide I'm going to end on. My last example of inspiration from Tahirih. It's a national Baha'i-inspired nonprofit organization called the Tahirih Justice Center that works every day to change the world and make it better. Named after Tahirih, the Tahirih Justice Center was founded by Layli Miller Muro in 1997 and has served over 30,000 immigrant survivors fleeing gender-based violence since 1997. Their transformative approach to ending gender-based violence combines free legal services and social services case management, advocacy, research-based training and education, and it advocates for a wide systemic change to end oppression for all, working to create a world in which all people share equal rights and live in safety with dignity. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Violetta. That was such a thorough presentation. So much knowledge there. So thank you for putting it together. At this time, if there are any questions, I have to ask that we keep the questions centered around the topic of discussion. So if you have those, you can raise your hand. The way to raise your hand is to click on the more. It's the reactions, and in the reactions, there's a raise hand button at the very end. So if you have questions, now's the time for that. And also, you should be able to unmute yourselves and ask it directly, or you can even send a question in the chat. You have everyone speechless, Violetta.
Oh, I probably don't have the answers to any of anyone's questions. I apologize that the birds singing.
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay. One of the poetry, I think was section 8, word Tahirih has taken from Farsi section, but it is correct to have it, and I read it to you, but it is in the English section of yours. This is the place that says, در دل خویش طاهره گشت و ندید جز تو را. The Tahirih is not there in this, and it breaks. The syllable is broken. در دل خویش گشت, it cannot do it. But in English, it does mention in her heart Tahirih.
Okay. All right. Great. I will have that fixed. I will look at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Loved it. Beautiful.
So if, do we have any other questions, comments? We can do some comments now, and then I guess we'll get ready and close
I just
out.
wanted to know, because I worked so hard on the poems. They were the hardest part of this whole talk. I was wondering if people who don't speak Persian and people who do speak Persian, did you enjoy having the poems before? Yeah. Was it nice to hear? Okay, good. Oh, God.
Very good.
Yes, a special thank you to our readers. Thank
Yes,
you.
Violetta and Sudabe saved my life. I never would have been able to read those poems. My voice goes after an hour of talking. I'm not a very solid person.
So, Violetta, do you have a email that people can directly email you in regards to?
Take my email down. Send me an email if you have any questions about the talk. I'll be happy to answer. Don't feel like you have to. So sorry, I have to look on my big screen. Making a mistake here in my email. There you go. Feel free to email me. There are probably a lot of stories in there that people didn't know, that I discovered myself. Be very honest with you, one of the main reasons I give talks at Clearwater is so that I can learn more about Baha'i history. So whatever I know about Tahirih is now in this talk. There's nothing outside of that I know that I kept for myself. And let's see. Next month, we're going to be discovering something. Please come. We're going to be talking about Hippolyte Dreyfus Barney. A big new biography was just written about him, the first one. And Hippolyte Dreyfus was especially beloved by Abdul Baha and by Shoghi Effendi, and he served them both for many, many years. And I talked to the author. I wrote the French. I read the book in French. I wrote the talk in English. And the whole purpose of this talk is to make noise before the English book is released. So believe me, we know nothing about Hippolyte Dreyfus compared to what Yann Ballanger has discovered. So that's next month. Can you remind me? Is it April? You don't know?
I don't know it off the top of my head. I'm sorry, but it will be up on the website. So check back on the website and for this and additional talks.
And then the month after that is going to be the story of the Baha'i Faith in Hamadan and the entry of large number of Jewish people into the faith. So please mark your calendar for that. Let me just tell you the dates for both of those. That's the story on, so 16th of April is the Hippolyte Dreyfus, and the 21st of May is the story of Hamadan. 16th of April and 21st of May. Anyway, thank you all for coming on Ayamiha. This was so nice.
Thank you.
Again, Violetta, thank you so much for your time and for your presentation. It was wonderful. And thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you all next week.
Thank you so much.
Have a good afternoon and a great Ayamiha. Bye.